his computer. All right, and what we're going to do is Jeff is going to speak first for about half an hour on the themes of his research, and then Karen and Scott in turn are going to give comments of about 10 minutes each, and then we're going to let Jeff respond for another quarter of an hour, and then we're going to open the floor to questions, but I'll need your questions to be submitted by the chat function. We're not going to try and mute and unmute and so on, because that gets really awkward and really difficult. So you're going to post your questions using the chat function, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. I will ask the questions and the others will then respond. So without further ado, welcome, Jeff. We are looking forward and eager to hear from you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Karine. Thank you very much for organizing. This is quite an honor for me. I should add, the book is actually out. It is out in its electronic version, which is available actually for free, thanks to a generous grant from the Mellon Foundation, it's a pilot program. The paperback edition will be out in December. Okay, I sort of assume that most of you have some idea what the consistory was. It was a disciplinary institution comprised of the pastors and elders. It was created by John Calvin, and it was so important to him. You know, it was the creation of the consistory was a condition that he put up for his return to Geneva after his return to Geneva in 1541 after being in Strasbourg for 3 years. We think of Calvin as being a great theologian, and he certainly was. No one's going to question that. But we get to really see him as pastor through his work on the consistory. And I think it's very important to remember that he dedicated the better part of at least one day a week, typically a Thursday, every week for the duration of his ministry until his death in 1564, occasionally 2 days a week. Dedicated a better part of a day to hear the problems that Genevans were having, the sins that they were guilty of. This book grew out of the project that Karine referred to publish the 21 volumes of the consistory. That project dates back to 1987, and of course was initiated by my late mentor, Bob Kingdon, who passed away 10 years ago. And I want to give a shout out to two different people. I'm quite happy that Tom Lambert has joined in. Tom is co-editor for the first 5 volumes, and we still keep in touch. He very graciously read parts of this book and made some very good suggestions. And I would really be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to my much better half, Isabella Watt, who has been there from the beginning. She's been a co-editor for all 14 volumes, and in Max volumes 15 and 16, which will be published as one tome, they're coming to you next week. Okay, they're coming to you next week. Okay. We expect to finish this project in about 6 years. That is the 21st volume, 1564, the year of his death. The registers of the consistory are a real gold mine of information. They provide insight to a wide range of issues that scholars are intensively researching, debating. They provide a front row seat to the reception of the Reformation in Geneva, and they really show Calvin's attitudes toward and his treatment of the common laity. The consistory summoned people for sins and misbehavior. More often than not, it limited itself to admonitions, to censures. It had the power to excommunicate. It did not have the power to impose secular penalties. Anybody deemed worthy or deemed deserving of a secular penalty was referred to the small council of 25, to the city council. And I should add that there is a parallel project to publish the registers of the council, les registres du conseil. And a little shout out to Christophe Chazalon. He lives in Cape Verde now, but he's been the co-editor of several volumes. I believe he's going to be seeing a recording of this rather than seeing it live. In its earliest years, the consistory was quite concerned with people who were ignorant about religion, or people who continued to adhere to Catholic practices. They were concerned about, Calvin and his colleagues were concerned about, truancy from church. And in the first years, the members of the consistory, comprised of the pastors and elders of Geneva, they might call somebody for, say, drunkenness, but they would also, ask this person about church attendance at church, and the ability to recite the Lord's Prayer and the Apostles' Creed. After a few years, those questions became rare, or rarer at any rate. And that suggests to me that by and large, Calvin and his associates were more or less pleased with the religious knowledge, with the church attendance and religious knowledge of the laity. Early on, there were a good number of actions taken against Catholic practices, like attending Mass in a neighboring community, saying prayers for the dead, saying prayers to the Virgin Mary. And give you one example really struck me. There was a woman who was giving birth, and when she was suffering the most intense pains of childbirth, she belted out a Hail Mary. And unfortunately for her, the sage-femme, the midwife, obviously told on her, and the consistory convoked her, gave her a scolding. She apologized, said she wouldn't do it again. It appears pretty clear to me that women had a harder time giving up some of those Catholic practices, probably most notably saying prayers to the Virgin Mary. Clearly, some women liked being able to pray to a female figure. The consistory had jurisdiction over issues pertaining to marriage, and the consistory records are an important means of seeing the impact of the Protestant Reformation on marriage and the family. Consistory quite often took action against, marital discord, domestic violence. Basically, though, Calvin and his colleagues just told the couple to get along, to stop fighting. That was it. There were two very memorable cases in which men beat their wives so severely that they put out one of their eyes. And in both cases, the consistory, rebuked the men, told them, to be gentler with their wives, but also, admonished the two women to obey their husbands and not to provoke them. Neither man was referred to the city council, therefore neither man spent even a day in jail for this extreme abuse. There was no grounds for a separation, let alone a divorce. Cruelty most definitely was not a ground for divorce. Divorce was very, very rare in Reformation Geneva, and there were essentially two grounds. Adultery, the ground that all Protestant reformers recognize as a justifiable reason for terminating a marriage, and desertion. Desertion, they set a very high bar for getting a divorce. For desertion, it usually was an absence, a very long absence, minimum 7 years typically, during which there was no communication between the two, and one could sort of assume that the absent spouse was dead. In that regard, I think it's very hard to say that the introduction of divorce can be viewed as a form of liberation for women. 1555 marked a turning point in Genevan history. It marked the defeats of the Péronistes, les enfants de Genève, the children of Geneva. These were locals who resented the growing authority of Calvin and the other pastors, who were all French, and the strict disciplinary regime that was championed by the consistory. After the defeats of the Péronistes, you see an expansion in the activity of the consistory. The number of people appearing before the consistory increased, and the consistory became more aggressive in attacking certain actions, and actually expanded the the number of sins or misdeeds that were under its purview. There's some interesting theories, which I assume most of you are familiar with, concerning the impact of Calvinism. The Weber thesis, a great thesis over 100 years ago, great sociologist Max Weber, who argued that Calvinism nurtured the spirit of capitalism. Weber, in coming up with this thesis, he looked at later Calvinists, most notably the Puritans of England, but I thought it'd be useful to see how applicable, if at all, this theory is to nascent Calvinism in Geneva. In his thesis, Weber put a lot of emphasis on predestination, the doctrine of predestination, and on the belief in calling or vocation. The idea that everyone, not just priests or monks, have a calling to a certain profession, and they had to dedicate themselves to that vocation with religious enthusiasm. If we look at the evidence from the consistory, on the one hand, the consistory definitely took aggressive actions against laziness and prodigality, the dissipation of goods. And in taking those actions, the consistory was especially concerned with young men. Calvin and his colleagues believed that it was essential to direct youths down the straight and narrow path, and it was going to be much easier to effect change in people's behavior if you got them when they were young rather than when they were old. To give you just one example, in October of 1560, the consistory expressed its alarm and sent to the small council a list of 44 young men who led a life of debauchery and hedonism. They were described as loafers, they were fainéants, who did not want to do anything than wander about aimlessly and dissipate the small amount of goods left to them by their parents. So the consistory did take aggressive actions, I should add, particularly especially after 1555, to get young men to learn a profession and get to work. While it strongly encouraged what we might refer to as the Protestant work ethic, Calvin and the consistory also convoked people for usury and price gouging. Now, these actions definitely show that Calvin and his associates were uneasy with certain aspects of capitalism. They certainly did not trust the invisible hand of the market, as described by Adam Smith a couple centuries later, whereby the conjunction of self-interest, competition, and supply and demand would supposedly result in an effective allocation of resources and enhance the overall wealth of a society. The pursuit of profits had to be tempered by charity and social welfare. Now, in and of itself, this most definitely does not disprove Weber, because he was looking again at later Calvinists, especially Puritans, but at least it shows you that I think there's certain ways in which he was right, certain other ways where it's clearly, his thesis clearly is not applicable. The records also shed light on another important theory, that of Calvinism and the secularization of mentality. Weber and others have said that Calvinism promoted a certain desacralization of mentality, whereby the supernatural supposedly played a reduced role in this world. I think evidence from Geneva can lend some credence to this view. Certainly there was a very strong belief in God's transcendence. Inside the churches, people did not genuflect before the altar. Indeed, there were no longer any altars in any church in Geneva. They had all been removed. They'd been replaced by a pulpit from which the pastor read scripture and gave a sermon. The highlight of the Catholic Mass is the celebration of the Eucharist. This involved all of the senses. For Calvinists, the center of the service was the sermon. In fact, in Geneva, the records of the consistory, they didn't refer to going to church. They referred to going to les sermons, the sermon, a typical sermon in Reformation Geneva lasted about an hour. It was based on lectio continua, the explication of Scripture. It was strictly an oral experience. Another example that sheds light on this purported desacralization of mentality involves the consistory's attacks on certain superstitions and magic. Quite often, the consistory convoked people for consulting diviners. It was forbidden to try to find somebody who they believed could predict the future. You have various superstitious cures as well. Therapeutic magic. There were cases involving a fountain in the nearby Pays de Vaud, where the water, people would go to get the water, and supposedly the water from that fountain was known to effect miraculous cures. The consistory regularly told people, if you were sick, you should basically, the message was you should go to a doctor. You shouldn't take part in these superstitious cures. But it's also true that I don't think they took they didn't take this therapeutic magic terribly seriously. This was the period of the most intense witch hunting that Europe ever experienced, and the consistory most definitely did not treat these folks who would indulge in these forms of white magic as being devil-worshipping witches. One of the most common reasons to be summoned before the consistory were quarrels, and the consistory always made great efforts to reconcile feuding parties, and this was especially the case just before the celebration of communion, or Calvin, as Calvin preferred to call it, the Holy Supper. The consistory claimed the exclusive right to determine who could and who could not participate in the supper, which was celebrated 4 times a year, in contrast to the Eucharist, which was celebrated at every Mass. Having the right spiritual state of mind when taking communion was for the consistory an essential reason to strive for reconciliation of feuding parties and for the penitence of sins. While on the subject of communion, the supper, I'd also like to give a shout out to Christian Gross, who had signed up. I'm not sure if he's actually present, but he had signed up, and I certainly think very, very highly of his wonderful book. On the celebration of. Quite often the consistory actually brought, summoned to it these feuding parties and actually exhorted, required them basically to reconcile. And quite often they actually did in the presence of the consistory. We can't know how sincere those reconciliations were. At the very least, though, it was quite rare for people once reconciled before the consistory to appear again because of quarrels, with the very important exception of married couples. Some of them went over and over and over again before the consistory. What the consistory really meant, and I don't think probably most of those who were reconciled, those feuding parties, did not all of a sudden become good friends. I don't think that was the goal of the consistory. The consistory wanted to maintain social order. It also wanted to make sure that people did not bear resentment towards others. Calvin and his colleagues were convinced that animosity towards others was incompatible with internal piety. And when dealing with most disputes, the consistory generally assumed that there was blame to go around and that all parties should ask each other for forgiveness and should forgive each other. I should add there was one minor exception to this rule. Whenever John Calvin himself was involved in a dispute, that was entirely the fault of the other person. There are 21 volumes of records I've gone through. I've never found a hint of Calvin ever apologizing for anything. Other than those cases, which comprise a tiny, tiny percentage of all quarrels, The consistory generally preferred promoting harmony to assigning guilt in handling those disputes. The consistory was also remarkably indulgent, I think, in dealing with cases of people who, after embracing the Reformed faith, later renounced it in a Catholic country, usually it was in France, under threat of death. And a good example was the treatments of Antoine Avaux, who was himself a former Augustinian friar. He was a native of France, and he had actually married a former nun. And in May of 1555, he appeared before the consistory and confessed that, quote, being in Paris, he was interrogated about his faith under oath and was greatly tempted and weak in his faith out of fear of being burned. So he disavowed and abjured his faith, recognizing his sin. He requests to be forgiven and to be readmitted to the supper. He also disavowed his wife there, end quote. His wife also admitted to having renounced her faith in France. The consistory decided that this couple should refrain from taking communion the next time it was celebrated. But 3 months later, they were going to be allowed to take communion, provided they truly were penitent of their, contrite for their sins. Now, in this era, when cases of apostasy heard before the Inquisition in Spain or Italy could result in capital punishment, those who renounced the Reformed faith to save their lives were routinely readmitted to communion in Geneva after being excluded just once, provided they were truly penitent. Evidently, Calvin, the consistory, and the magistrates of Geneva did not demand martyrdom of all those facing persecution. The actions of the consistory allow us to compare it with similar contemporary disciplinary institutions, most obviously the Catholic Inquisition. I should add that the original title that I wanted for this book was The Protestant Inquisition, ? The Consistory in Calvin's Geneva. The folks at the University of Rochester, folks in marketing at the University of Rochester Press, however, did not like the question mark. And I just could not substitute the question mark for with a colon. And so I ditched that, and thus we have the new title of the book. Having conducted research on both the Consistory of Geneva and the Roman Inquisition, I do notice some certain parallels between them. Both institutions aggressively attacked religious beliefs and practice that were deemed unacceptable, and I think enjoyed a fair degree of success in creating religious uniformity. There were, however, some very important differences between the Inquisition in Italy and the Consistory of Geneva. Investigations by the Inquisition occasionally resulted in executions. As noted, the consistory could only admonish and at most excommunicate. While for the most part, the consistory sought conformity in word and deed, the Inquisition demanded conformity in word, deed, and thought. The Inquisition tried to examine the minds and the souls of people and to regulate belief as well as behavior more than the consistory did. True, the consistory constantly exhorted Genevans to examine their own consciences in order to repent of their sins and to suppress all feelings of rancor toward others. Calvin and the other members of the consistory definitely sought the interiorization of Reformed piety among the laity. I believe that the Genevan consistory was actually a much more intrusive institution than the Roman Inquisition was, and had the ability to effect greater changes in behavior among the laity. Typically, about 5% of Geneva's population appeared before the consistory, either as defendants, as witnesses, or occasionally as plaintiffs. By contrast, only a tiny percentage of the population of Italy appeared before any of the Inquisitions there. The Inquisition, it's true in Italy, true in Spain, did not have jurisdiction over misdeeds unless heresy, blasphemy, apostasy, or abuse of sacraments was alleged. The Consistory of Geneva had the power to convoke those suspected of deviating from reform mores in any way. It regularly convoked people for fornication, domestic violence, drunkenness, dissipation of assets, quarrels, dancing, card playing, mundane songs, none of which would have been a reason to be summoned by the Inquisition. Considered in all its aspects, I believe that the consistory resembled much more the Catholic confessor than the inquisitor. Scholars have aptly suggested that the confessor was analogous to a physician for the soul, whose ultimate goal was to reintegrate the sinner into the Christian community. The Consistory of Geneva, in effect, served the same function. The consistory's weekly meetings, however, almost surely had a greater impact on the behavior of the laity than did the annual confession of Catholics, which usually took place before Easter. Okay, in his work on the consistory, again, we see Calvin as pastor, and I think we see him at his best and at his worst. Make no mistake about it, he was arrogant. Calvin believed that he had never met his intellectual equal. He was probably right in that regard, and he definitely was not too concerned about being guilty himself of the sin of pride. He ruthlessly attacked anyone who questioned his authority or that of the consistory. But we also see him at his best, as pastor, earnestly trying to settle differences among parishioners. One case that really comes to mind, a case of a couple who had been quarreling, and they'd been summoned before the consistory. One morning when the consistory convened, the couple who had been summoned were not there. Well, Calvin actually explained to his colleagues that they had come to his abode the night before to talk things over. He had a lengthy discussion with them, and he said that he reconciled them. And he told them, therefore, there was no need for them to appear before the consistory the next day. This certainly suggests that this couple viewed Calvin, if not as a marriage counselor, at least a pastor who could, with whom they could express their concerns. And, according to Calvin himself, they seem to have worked things out. I should add, it didn't take, because they were back before the consistory for other future conflicts more than once after that. When possible, Calvin and the consistory preferred relying more on persuasion than on persecution in trying to effect change in the lives of Genevans. How successful was it in attacking ignorance? I think the consistory was pretty successful. By the time of Calvin's death, it was rare to find a native Genevan who didn't know the basics of the Reformed faith. The records also suggest that the consistory was pretty successful in rooting out Catholic practices, making the sign of the cross, praying to the Virgin Mary. Again, those actions became much rarer as the years progressed. So, as far as beliefs, ignorance, I think they enjoyed some success in the area of pedagogy. As far as behavior is concerned, I think the consistory was less successful in attacking, say, fornication and drunkenness. Genevans continue to get drunk. They continue to have sex outside of marriage. But it did seem successful in getting Genevans to examine their consciences before taking communion. Calvin and his colleagues really tried to get people to internalize Reformed piety. A good example is how cases of blasphemy appeared before the consistory. It was a fairly common sin. there are many instances in which someone who blasphemed was heard in the streets, and an onlooker reproached that person right away and said, okay, hey, that is totally unacceptable. You get on your knees and ask for forgiveness from God. And on many occasions, they did so. The guy, he was almost always a man, he would get on his knees, ask for God for forgiveness, and then would also be called again before the consistory. And I think this shows you that not only those who heard the blasphemy, but even the blasphemers recognized that that was a behavior that should not be done. People genuinely tried to put aside anger and settle their differences. There was one memorable case in which two women had been feuding for quite some time. And finally, the husband of one of them tried to arrange a formal, reconciliation. He invited the other couple to their abode, plus about 3 or 4 women to serve as witnesses. And he was trying to get them both to, forgive and forget. It didn't work out because the other woman just said, well, I will accept your apology, but I'm sure I'm not going to apologize to you, or words to that effect. And so the reason we know about it is because it appeared before the consistory, because that attempted reconciliation failed. But the fact that on their own initiative, this couple, tried to initiate that certainly shows that they had assimilated the idea that you should not bear rancor towards others. Thanks to its tenacious efforts to root out misbehavior and personal conflicts, I think the consistory was nurturing a certain sense of community. More broadly, it's fair to say that in overseeing morality, the consistory of Geneva functioned in both a top-down, and the pastors and elders definitely could be heavy-handed in trying to enforce reformed mores. And in the early 1550s, a minority of Genevans, the enfants de Genève, clearly resented the growing power of Calvin and the consistory. Many people obviously thought that there was nothing wrong with, say, dancing. And the aggressive efforts to forbid giving the names of saints to babies, Calvin insisted only biblical names be given to babies, needlessly alienated a good number of locals. On the other hand, the sheer volume of cases that came before the consistory provides strong evidence that Genevans in general shared the ideals promoted by Calvin and his associates. It was very intrusive, but the consistory did not have the personnel to surveil closely the daily lives of residents. It depended upon the cooperation of the rank and file to identify people who were suspected of fornicating, gambling, praying to saints, and other activities deemed sinful. Residents of Calvin's Geneva were, in effect, practicing a form of neighborhood watch. Some of those who denounced others, no doubt, might have been trying to settle scores with their enemies rather than bringing them back to the straight and narrow path, a danger that was not lost on the consistory, by the way. It is evident, however, that for the most part, Calvin and his colleagues espoused a brand of morality that the large majority of Genevans embraced. In his first publication about the consistory way back in 1972, Bob Kingdon described the institution as imposing, and I quote, a kind of reign of moral terror in Geneva. But he greatly modified that view later, describing the consistory as more akin to a mandatory counseling service than a tribunal. In fulfilling its important role in trying to settle quarrels, the consistory definitely did have much in common with a counseling service. Many Genevans obviously assimilated the idea of should not bear rancor towards others, and they actually refrained from taking communion if they really felt, they were not in the right state of mind. Be that as it may, make no mistake about it, the consistory was a punitive institution. Having to appear before the consistory could be daunting. Especially after 1555, Calvin and his colleagues could be very heavy-handed. Their handling of certain cases seemed unduly harsh, and this was a reaction more often than not when they felt that their reputations or their authority were being called into question. Weighing all the evidence, we can't, I think it's safe to say that during Calvin's ministry, the consistory enjoyed a remarkable degree of success in reforming the mores of, for better or for worse, the mores of the Genevan laity. Moreover, this study finds that there was a strong synergy between discipline and the Reformed movement. Geneva was simply, I think, the best example of this symbiotic relationship. The institution that Calvin created, the Consistory of Geneva, was really the Reformed disciplinary institution par excellence, and it exerted a strong influence that went far beyond the confines of this small republic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jeff. So we're all clapping, right? Yay. Okay, now we're going to hear from Karen Spierling with her remarks.
Thank you. Okay, I'm just trying to adjust myself so I don't have weird light on my face in the late afternoon. Thank you so much, Jeff, for a great presentation and also a wonderful book that I feel privileged to be one of the first people in this group that has read it, but I have no doubt that everyone else is going to go for that online copy or buy the paperback because you want to be able to hold it in your hands. So I just want to start out by saying, acknowledging what, again, everyone here knows what a great debt of gratitude all of us who work on Geneva or social discipline during the Reformation more broadly owe to Jeff and to Isabella as well. Their persistence over the past 2 decades in continuing with this project and with the support of Max and Joel. There's really no way to sort of tally what we owe to them. So thank you to all of you, and especially to Jeff and Isabella for continuing with this and for doing the work so well and so thoroughly and so thoughtfully in ways that make it so useful to all of us. So yes, I see Elsie clapping there. Thank you. I also just want to take a minute to note that I think as I was listening to Jeff talk, I was remembering watching Bob Kingdon when he would come to panels of his students and the smile that he would have on his face because he was so proud. And I just think he would be so proud right now to see what this book that Jeff has brought to fruition and the career that has led up to that. So as I was one of Bob's last students, and Jeff was always one of those people being referred to in seminars as, maybe you can be like that when you grow up someday. So I want to acknowledge sort of the spirit of Bob Kingdon, who is here for this discussion. This book is such a gift to Reformation historians because there are many of us here who have been working on different aspects of the consistory over the years. But this is the first sort of collection, first time that we have a single discussion of the work of the consistory over the period of Calvin's lifetime. And you can go back and look through many different articles and even books that some of us here have written where we sort of can make a statement about a certain period of time and make a speculation that carries through the whole period of Calvin's time in the consistory records. But now we have that all brought together. So Jeff is clearly one of the few people, maybe the person who knows this period of the consistory records inside and out and has these details at his fingertips. And the fact that, Jeff, you're able to bring that all together so clearly and lucidly, I think is a major achievement. It would be easy to try to get sort of lost in all the details of all the stories to tell. But I think one of the great achievements of this volume is the clarity of thought and writing, and the clear picture of the work that the consistory did from its beginning through into the 1560s. The ways that their interests changed over time, the ways that their sort of driving concerns persisted over time, and the fact that all the way through, there were these sort of discussions that were going on with the people that were brought before the consistory that helped to shape what life would look like in Reformation Geneva, right? So of all the things, of all the great value in the consistory records, they do not, in the end, give us a lot of detail about what happened inside of worship services. And they do not give us a whole lot of detail about theological discussions, right? As Jeff notes a number of different places in this book, there's not a lot of theological debate that happens in consistory meetings. But what they do tell us are this incredibly detailed and three-dimensional picture of life in Reformation Geneva, of what it looked like for such a variety of people to live a reformed life, and how that developed over time, and what some of the challenges of that were. So I think what I most want to do, I know that there are a lot of people here who are going to have a lot of great questions. And what I mainly want to do is just set out a couple of questions for Jeff, realizing that in these kinds of projects, we're always constrained by, the marketers who don't like the title that we want to use, by the publisher's insistence on using endnotes instead of footnotes, or right, all of that. And one thing that I think you'll all see when you have a chance to look at the book is this is not just a very clear narrative about the priorities and actions of the consistory, but the endnotes are just an incredible discussion of the historiography surrounding social discipline and the consistory over recent decades. And so I think what I'd like to do is just, Jeff, put a couple of questions on the table to ask you to sort of reflect further on what maybe there wasn't space to talk about in the book. One of the points that I love that you make right at the beginning is this point about how the consistory records are so useful for us to get a window into popular culture, even a little bit, right? Despite the fact that they were the records were taken by elite educated men, and they were formed by the priorities of the church. And so my question for you is, given all of the work that you have done, even beyond the consistory, and your work on marriage and suicide and possession, and all the different ways that you've looked at early modern society and culture, I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on the ways that the early modern context can also help us to understand the priorities of the consistory. So if the consistory record can help us to see sort of into the shape of early modern society and culture, how can thinking more broadly about early modern society and culture also help us understand the decisions that the consistory was making, and the topics that it was choosing to focus on? And then I have many questions, but one other question that I was especially struck in your discussion here, and also in the book, about these comparisons that you've been thinking about for many years now between the consistory and the Inquisition. I wonder if you can reflect at all on whether the fact that the consistory just has this obvious difference, that the consistory has laity on it, as well as clergy. If you think that difference is significant in understanding the impact of the consistory versus the Inquisition on the societies that they were operating in. And I look forward to many further discussions with you about that, but I will pass it off to Scott.
Thank you so much, Karen. And now we'll hear from Scott.
Well, Jeffrey, it's a pleasure for me to be a part of this panel. I feel so honored. And with Karen, I'm just so deeply impressed and appreciative for your wonderful book. So thank you. And for yours and Isabella's service to the scholarly community over these last number of years, last decades, as you've served us all well through your work of editing the consistory minutes. My comments are prepared, so I'm going to read this paper. It'll be about a 10-minute presentation. It is our happy occasion this afternoon to celebrate the publication of Jeffrey Watt's excellent new book, The Consistory and Social Discipline in Calvin's Geneva. In the course of his long and productive career, Dr. Watt has taught us much about church and society in early modern Europe through his careful scholarship exploring religious discipline and reformed consistories in Neuchâtel, Geneva, and beyond. In addition, Jeffrey Watt, together with his wife Isabella Watt, have meticulously edited and guided to publication multiple volumes of the Registers of the Consistory of Geneva, the most recent volumes covering the years 1558 and 1559, which will appear soon. Dr. Watt's present monograph, which explores Calvin's consistory from 1542 to 1564, reflects the rich harvest of his engagement with these important historical sources. After giving a brief account of the founding and institutional history of Calvin's consistory, Watt examines the expansive functions of this disciplinary body of pastors and elders as it enforced religious uniformity, educated and disciplined children, regulated marriage, suppressed superstition, magic, and witchcraft, promoted industrious and frugal citizens, and worked to repair broken relationships and effect reconciliation. Watt's narrative is particularly sensitive to the hundreds of men and women who appeared as defendants before the consistory each year. Their personal struggles and moral predicaments, many of them tragic, are examined by Watt with great insight, sympathy, and charity. Dr. Watt's research engages with and corroborates the findings of a growing number of historians who have studied Reformed consistories during this period, including the work of Robert Kingdon, Raymond Menser, Thomas Lambert, Karen Spierling, Christian Gross, Scott Manetsch, and Margot Todd. Watt demonstrates that in practice, Geneva's consistory focused more on right behavior and right worship than on right belief. It functioned more as a morals court than as a theological tribunal, and in this way, it was significantly different than the Roman Inquisition, as Jeffrey's indicated. Conflicts within families or between neighbors constituted the single most common type of misbehavior appearing on the consistory's weekly docket. As with Kingdon and others, Watt argues that Calvin's consistory frequently functioned as a kind of mandatory counseling service that sought to pacify violent quarrels and heal broken relationships. As a general rule, the disciplinary activity of ministers and elders reinforced norms of behavior shared by most of Geneva's residents, and usually avoided double standards based on class or gender. With that said, however, Watt demonstrates that the members of Geneva's consistory defended patterns of patriarchy and male dominance in family life that too often jeopardized the health and safety of women and children. Consequently, he judges as too sanguine the assertions in my book that consistorial discipline, quote, protected the weakest members of Geneva's society. He writes, here I quote, "There were real limits to the support that the consistory provided to the vulnerable, be they battered women, abused children, or pregnant maidservants." A most impressive aspect of Jeffrey Watt's study is the way in which he employs evidence from the consistorial records to address larger historical questions and debates. His treatment of Max Weber's thesis that Calvinism contributed to the emergence of modern capitalism is a good example. Calvin and his consistory supported a strong work ethic, abolished Catholic holidays, allowed for the charging of interest on loans, encouraged sober lifestyles, and opposed the dissipation of people's goods. All factors that indicate an elective affinity between Calvinism and modern capitalism. But Watt shows that the prevailing winds of Calvin's discipline could also blow in the opposite direction, given that the consistory prohibited price gouging and exorbitant rates of interest, warned against avarice and the desire for excessive wealth, and defended public charity and social welfare. Watt judiciously concludes that whatever one's assessment of Weber's thesis, Calvin's brand of social discipline was a significant factor in Geneva's impressive economic growth during the centuries that followed. Dr. Watt brings his research to bear on other pressing historical debates. He pushes back against the famous failure thesis of Gerald Strauss, who once argued that Lutheran pedagogy was, for the most part, unsuccessful in transforming the behavior and religious conscience of Protestant laity in late 16th century Germany. By contrast, Watt finds evidence in the consistory's treatment of heresy, Catholic belief, and religious ignorance that Calvin's program of discipline and catechesis was largely successful in producing in Geneva a devoted Protestant laity committed to the basic tenets of the Reformed religion. According to Watt, consistorial discipline also shaped the way that ordinary Genevans understood the sacred and supernatural. In the consistory's campaign against Catholic rituals, the cult of saints, and therapeutic magic, and in its surprisingly moderate treatment of people accused of witchcraft, Calvin and his colleagues promoted a more transcendent form of piety that restricted lay people's access to God and the supernatural, ultimately contributing to the disenchantment of the Christian religion and a more secular outlook. These examples show that, from Watt's perspective, Calvin's brand of religious discipline was rigorous, intrusive, and largely successful in shaping Geneva's society in the 16th century. Jeffrey Watt's monograph, The Consistory and Social Discipline in Calvin's Geneva, is an important book that makes a substantial contribution to our understanding of Reformed discipline and its impact on early modern Europe. We should also add that this monograph is exceedingly well written and readable, as it weaves countless numbers of surprising, amusing, and horrifying disciplinary cases together with careful historical interpretation and compelling argumentation. In my final minutes, I would like to raise several questions that may invite further conversation. First, Jeffrey Watt demonstrates that in significant ways, Calvinist discipline served as a Protestant replacement for the Catholic sacrament of penance. Even so, his analysis calls attention primarily to the consistory's concern to reform the words and deeds of defendants, rather than to effect changes in conscience or attitude. I wonder if Dr. Watt would say more about the ways that Geneva's pastors and elders sought to encourage inner piety and heartfelt repentance in their disciplinary work. Second, as noted earlier, Dr. Watt argues that my book is overly positive in its assessment of the consistory's efforts to protect the weakest members of Geneva's society, given the minister's complicity in the system of patriarchy of early modern Europe that was particularly harsh toward women and children. I think his critique is fair, and that my interpretation needs to situate more carefully Calvinist discipline within the pervasive system of patriarchy characteristic of the period. With that said, however, my reading of the consistory minutes still identifies a sizable number of cases where the ministers and elders disciplined behavior they judged to be especially cruel or inhumane and endeavored to protect victims of extreme brutality, violence, or wanton neglect, whether they be men, women, or children. I would be interested in hearing how Dr. Watt would evaluate such a claim. And then third, Jeffrey Watt finds no explicit evidence that Calvin's consistory ever practiced full excommunication, social ostracism, or expulsion of the sinner from the Christian community, though he notes that the French word excommunier and its cognates occasionally find their way into the consistorial register. At the same time, as Christian Gross has shown, the Edict of 1560 stipulated that in extreme cases where defendants remained incorrigible and unwilling to submit to church discipline, they should be excommunicated, excommuniae, and their names announced in the church, quote, so that everyone might abstain from their company, unquote. This protocol was thereafter incorporated into a revision of the ecclesiastical ordinances in 1561. My study of the consistory minutes during the decades following Calvin's death bears out this pattern. Each year, a handful of defendants received the sentence of excommunication. In some of these cases, certainly not all, but in some of these cases, the minutes indicate that the excommunication was announced publicly from the pulpit. And in several instances, the consistory thereafter requested the small council to banish the offender from the city, either permanently or temporarily. These disciplinary steps, excommunication, public announcement, banishment, are evident in a case of an accused fornicator named Claude Maurice from the village of Jussy, who repeatedly refused to admit her guilt and was subsequently excommunicated and temporarily banished from Geneva's territory in 1560. And Dr. Watt beautifully recounts her story in chapter 7 of his book. This strikes me as a clear case of full excommunication, with conciliar banishment achieving the social ostracism of the guilty party. I'm interested then how Dr. Watt would assess my suggestion that in some cases, banishment from Geneva signaled the completion of a disciplinary process of full excommunication. In conclusion, Jeffrey Watt's excellent study of the consistory in Calvin's Geneva deserves our praise and deep gratitude. Thank you, Dr. Watt, for enriching our understanding of early modern Europe through your most stimulating scholarship. And again, thanks so much.
Thank you both, Karen and Scott, for your really helpful overviews. And now we're going to give Jeff a chance to respond. If you'd like to, I think, focus primarily on the questions that were asked, because then we have a lot of questions lined up in the chat that I want to get to as well.
Yeah, probably I could use your prayers as well. Thank you very much, Scott. Thank you both very much for your comments. I really do appreciate it. I am somewhat worried about the sin of pride here, so I really appreciate the comments. The compliments. In regard to Karen's questions, I think the early modern context, I think, what permeates the consistory records, patriarchy, for example, things that really are striking is there was absolutely no concept of privacy at this time. Everybody in Geneva was sort of responsible for, narking on everybody else. You see somebody doing something they shouldn't be doing, that should be, you're supposed to be telling people about that. There were occasions when the consistory reproached somebody because they believed that the person was motivated by enmity toward the sinner rather than out of genuine piety. But I think the emphasis on patriarchy, the fact that religion really permeated Genevan society is quite striking. The fact that there were sermons available, basically like close to 24 a week, every day of the week, is quite striking as well. As far as the Inquisition and the consistory, the Inquisition actually did have some lay figures, and so it was not an entirely ecclesiastical institution. In fact, the microhistory that I wrote, most of the investigation was actually conducted by a lay official. In fact, that was one of the criticisms of the congregation in Rome. So that might be a factor. I think the difference there are a lot of differences in the two institutions. Okay, first off, what the consistory and the success that it enjoyed, it helps a lot that we're dealing with a very small city-state, and it was you're much more likely to be able to oversee a small population like that. rather than say, the Inquisition of Modena had jurisdiction over several, a very sizable region, And I think that's an important difference. I think the biggest difference I see is what's under their purview, which I described there as being the Inquisition. If you didn't have heresy, apostasy, abuse of sacraments and such, then you weren't going to be called before the Inquisition. But they are very interesting institutions. I thank you very much for your comments, Karen. Thank you, Scott, very much. And I have the highest regard for your wonderful book, by the way. And the number of times that I cited your book, Karen's book, and Christian Gross. Hi, Christian. Christian Gross's wonderful book on communion, shows you the high regard that I have. I did have somewhat, different somewhat on your positive take on the protection of the weakest members of society, particularly the victims of domestic violence. There's no doubt that the consistory did take action. Some men were sent to jail for their domestic violence by the council, and sometimes not even life-threatening. Only one woman, however, during the entire period of Calvin's ministry, was allowed a separation for domestic violence, and her life clearly was in danger. I mean, his own father testified against him, and she got a divorce only when he committed adultery. I will stand corrected, and there is that case of the woman from Jussy. In effect, that announcement, that was basically, that's akin to full excommunication. But certainly during Calvin's ministry, it's the word excommuniate is rarely used, and it really, it's the overwhelming majority. The emphasis is really exclusion from the supper. And I think even if they wanted to ostracize somebody, in doing that, short of the banishment that you mentioned, I think would have been next to impossible. But now your criticism, comments are very well taken. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff, for those responses. I'd like to turn now to some of the questions that have come in over the chat. So I'm going to read the questions, and then Jeff, you just keep your mic open and you can go ahead and answer. And if there's any points that come up where anyone else, Karen or Scott, if you have anything you want to add at any point, you can definitely do that. So the first question I had that came in was from Philip Benedict. And he has two questions. The first one is primarily dealing with the relation between the consistory and the civil authorities. So I'm just going to read what he wrote. The consistory couldn't issue death sentences like the Inquisition, but it could and did refer cases to the civil authorities. Just how did the consistory and the council work together? Did you find much evidence of misbehavior first observed by civil authorities and then referred to the consistory? Did evidence that came out in consistory meetings get passed along to the council? Were they interlocking parts of a coordinated system of control or separate institutions? So I'll let you respond to that before I go any further.
Okay. Yes, and yes. Okay. There were members of the elders. The elders were all members of one of the councils. The Council of 25, Council of 60, Council of 200. The consistory was presided over by one of the four syndics, and the four syndics were the premier executive officers in the Republic of Geneva. So yes, they were very much interconnected. The consistory regularly referred people to the council. The council sometimes referred people to the consistory. The council might say, well, such and such a person, sometimes the council would ask consistory, do you think this person has asked to be readmitted to somebody's been banished for some reason or another? Comes before the council asking to be readmitted. They say, well, let's confer with the consistory. So it went back and forth. They were two parallel institutions with an overlapping membership. Now at times they were at cross purposes, and that was quite clear sometimes in the early 1550s. And when certain individuals tried to be readmitted to communion by the council, trying to do an end run around around the consistory, Calvin got furious, and he and other pastors, sometimes more than once, went to the consistory, to the council to protest vigorously, claiming that at one point, Calvin said, "I'd rather die than put up with this." So they insisted. So two parallel, complementary, and to a certain extent overlapping institutions. Thank you for that.
Absolutely. And it kind of ties in nicely what you just said to the next part of Philip Benedict's question, which is, Calvin never apologized. Did any of the other pastors, were they ever reprimanded or willing to share blame for one part of a conflict? So other pastors other than Calvin.
Good question, Phil. There are certain cases where pastors were themselves reproached by the consistory. It's not so. Okay, I'm trying to remember an apology of a member of a pastor to the consistory. I'm more thinking of cases of certain individuals being rebuked, and rather than apologizing, but. Certainly other pastors were there. Calvin was not necessarily the most volatile pastor. There was another one who was seemingly gratuitously would anger certain individuals. And I certainly can't think of any instance in which he apologized. And quite frankly, he probably should have, Monsieur Raymond, he probably should have apologized 1,000 times over. But I think the short answer that is probably not. I can't think of anything. Thank you, Phil. Appreciate it.
All right. The sort of in the same line from Jim West, you mentioned that Calvin never admitted being wrong, but did any of the magistrates or clergy tell Calvin that he was wrong to his face, or was he too powerful for even that?
Definitely to his face, yes. The council, for sure. The council for sure told him, like when he said, "I'd rather die than they were saying he was really out of line. That he had no business speaking to them like that. A pastor telling him that to his face, I can't think of any. But oh by golly, if he got wind of somebody, there's one case where a pastor had been at one of the other pastors having a dinner with an individual, and who was bad-mouthing Calvin, and this other pastor said something like, "Well, yeah, he's a real hothead. Let's face it." Calvin, to prove that he was not a hothead, was just hell bent on kicking this guy out of the ministry, and succeeded in Geneva. He found employment elsewhere as a pastor. So, but that was not to his face. That was at, probably a few too many glasses of wine, and somebody present revealed that conversation to Calvin. It came before the consistory, and there were, some pretty serious repercussions. There were plenty of people who had lots to complain about Calvin before 1555. After 1555, criticism is going to be much more muted.
Yeah, absolutely. A question from Tom Lambert. Jeff, thank you for your presentation. And he has two questions, but I'm going to pick one of them. He's interested in superstition, and his question is as follows. What is the difference between superstition and religion? And who gets to decide which is which, both in the 16th century and when working as a scholar? Because that's a very interesting question. I think a very important one.
Right. Superstition is defined, it's in the eyes of the beholder. And one person's religion is another person's superstition.
Mm-hmm.
When we're dealing with, when we're dealing with therapeutic superstitions, this is something that actually Catholics and Calvinists had in mind. The most common form of case appearing before the Italian Inquisition, the Roman Inquisition, excuse me, in the very late 16th, early 17th century, dealt with superstitions, quite often therapeutic magic. But it's entirely in the eyes of the beholder, and I'm quite sure that the fountains, the trips to the fountain to get the water would have been tolerated by the Bishop of Geneva back in the day, but were unacceptable to Calvin because he associated that. They associated that with the veneration of saints. But great question, and I know what various scholars say the difference between magic and religion, but superstition is just the question of one's perspective.
Absolutely. A question for Sabine from Sabine Hiepsch. She's interested in a question which I think Scott also referred to, the comparison between the consistory and the Catholic confessor. And her question is, was the work of the consistory also in fact aimed at the education of the conscience? Was the aim, in a way, to make the work of the consistory eventually superfluous?
Mm-hmm. The consistory was, I think the consistory was, it was above all concerned with behavior. There was a strong desire to get people to internalize this behavior. But I guess in a way, I mean, in the same way that if people were angels, there'd be no need for government. I think if everyone really internalized reform morality as Calvin and his colleagues envisioned it, that they probably would have expected that there would be very little activity for the consistory to hear. So I think it was more concerned with behavior. There was an element of and my ideas changed on this over the years. When I first looked at Volume 1, I said it's just behavior. They're trying to get you to learn the basics, the Lord's Prayer, the Apostles' Creed, but they're not interested really in studying one's beliefs and studying investigating the minds, the thoughts of individuals. I modified that view somewhat in the work on the later years when they were really talking about the need to think about one's conscience. As Christian Gross found, they argued that if taking communion could supposedly be, reference to Apostle Paul, could be like poison if you were not in the right frame of mind. So it was counterproductive. But that's mainly when you're dealing with the repentance of sins. They did want people to be truly penitent, and sometimes the consistory expressed skepticism about somebody was really penitent and warned them, you okay, we're not sure you're really penitent. You say you are. If you take it at your own risk. So I didn't do a very good job answering that question, but
it's tricky to get into that question about what is the inner change. I think that's what we're all often looking for, but it's hard to find.
Right.
Question from Ward Holder. You noted that the Genevan consistory was unable to change Genevan behavior around drunkenness and fornication. Were any ecclesiastical disciplinary bodies effective in affecting those two behaviors?
Let's see. Bob Kingdon actually Bob Kingdon actually thought that the Genevan Consistory enjoyed more success than I feel they had in battling and attacking fornication. I guess I'm a bit more skeptical in that regard. And I can't name an institution that enjoyed much success. I mean, I was aware of this way back when I was doing work on Neuchâtel. I'll never forget a case of the minister preaching from the pulpit against drunkenness, and one of his parishioners looked up at him and interrupted him. Are you talking to me? Because he was evidently a notorious drunk. But one interesting thing, a question that Christophe Chazalon actually asked me, Christophe was not able to be here, but he's done a lot of work on the council. He asked, how much of a deterrent was going to jail? I mean, he rightly pointed out that going to jail was not necessarily all that intimidating. Indeed, Calvin himself complained that, let's see, it was in 1546, I believe. Calvin himself was complaining. He and one of the lay members of the consistory went to the council to protest that, in the jail, there's great disorder. People are bringing in extra food for the people. They're supposed to be on bread and water. They're supposed to be on bread and water in the jail, but they're practically, they're singing, they're having a grand time. And he's saying, hey, this is jail. In fact, the jailer was afterwards jailed because he was allowing this misbehavior to take place. The instance I'm thinking it was 1556. So I do think that most people would have preferred not going to jail for 3 days was the default penalty for pretty much everything for a first time offense. I think it was nonetheless a certain deterrent. Most people would prefer not going to jail. On the other hand, if you're talking about a young couple and they're thinking about the odds of getting caught, maybe they say, well, hey, it might be worth, a roll in the hay might be worth risking. I mean, who's going to catch us? Who knows? But that was a long, convoluted, very poor answer to your good question. I don't know of an institution that enjoyed a great deal of success. One thing that's clear that is in my work on Neuchâtel, if you can use illegitimate births as a barometer, and the only illegitimate births as a barometer, premarital sex was unusual unless you're talking about the very literal sense of premarital, because I remember in the 18th century, there was a noticeable increase in premarital conceptions, large increase in the number of births that took place within, say, 7 months of marriage. But the illegitimacy rate was still quite low.
Okay, we're getting close to our close time, but I want to get, I think, 2 more questions in if I can. From Esther Chung Kim, asking about religious knowledge and ignorance. The consistory showed concern in the early years, and this concern resurfaces with the influx of refugees in the late 1550s. Is this a continuous concern into the 1560s? Also, in the measures against excess and luxury, how important is the factor that such behaviors could lead to poverty?
Whenever there'd be an influx of refugees, there tended to be an increase in concern shown for ignorance. And there was definitely an uptick in that activity in the late 1550s. As far as the issue of luxury, there was definitely a concern about that. But they also, one item that comes to mind were some breeches. There were some men's breeches that were apparently very costly. And I mean, the sumptuary laws, there were sumptuary laws that forbade them, and yet many were still getting them. There was definitely a concern about poverty, but I think there were some people buying them who definitely could afford them. Mm-hmm. And this one gentleman, I remember, he bought these expensive breeches because he was buying land in nearby Savoy, I believe it was, and he argued that he needed to look good for this purchase, and he was told, well, you're not allowed to wear them. Obviously, he had the means to buy them, so I don't think they really thought he was going to fall into poverty. It could be that their concern was if that really became the mode, the style, that others who could not afford that type of garment might be inclined to go in over their heads.
Yep. So I'll give you a final question, which actually comes from Baptiste Verli, who says, among all the cases you worked on along your life, is there any of them which is your favorite one, which is the one you often love to talk about because you really think that it encapsulates a fundamental aspect of the history of the consistory? In short, if there is one, what's Jeff Watt's favorite consistory case?
Oh, Baptiste, that's a tough question. It's not the case involving the man who was rebuked for naming his dog Calvin. That's not the one, though I thought I got a good chuckle out of that. It might, man, let's see. Well, probably the single best case is the case of the woman, who was some of you heard me make a presentation about her at the SCSC back in 2017, I believe. She was supposedly, was receiving revelations from God, and she claimed that John Calvin was her husband. God wanted her to be his husband, and she was to be her husband. And she obviously was not playing. I mean, she had some pretty crazy ideas, to be sure. She had some rather creative means of interpreting scripture, but I'd say that particular case is probably the most memorable one. And she was a widow at the time, would eventually marry. She was jailed, banished, allowed back in. And what struck me about it was, on the one hand, she was claiming to be a prophet, and she was basically treated as being crazy. And I sort of view it as she probably benefited to a degree by the sexism of Calvin and his colleagues, in that they didn't take her seriously. And perhaps if a male had been saying similar things about receiving revelations from God, he might have gotten in greater trouble than she was. But it was a very colorful case, and I think it sheds light on a number of things in a number of different ways. So
terrific. And we're just about at 5 o'clock, which is our cutting off time. But I'd like to first take an opportunity to thank Jeff Watt, first of all, for his presentation and his book. So everyone can join me. You can unmute if you want and give a round of applause. This is great. We're so pleased, Jeff.
Thank you.
Then thank you also to Karen and to Scott for their very helpful insights into the book and its themes. I have got from Jim West actually a link to the online version of Jeff's book. So we'll send everyone a copy of that link so you can get the online version if you can't wait to get the hard copy version in your hand. But in
just
the
paperback. There's no hard
copy. Okay, so the paperback versus the hardback copy. Okay, but there will be a paperback version coming out. But if you want it before that, you're going to get the link for the online version, and that should help you as well. And in the meantime, it simply remains for me to say thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to see all of you, and we will do more of these sessions, hopefully after the new year. All right? Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
all for coming. Really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.